Hello. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome and thank you. Thank you for joining us tonight for the State of Black Annapolis. A round of applause just for that. I'm Erica Griswold, and I am the Community Resource Coordinator for the City of Annapolis, and I will be moderating this event tonight. This event is so special in so many ways. It's going to be outlining a general understanding of what slavery looked like, right? Past, present, and future. Tonight we have the panelists here, 4 panelists that will be covering just that. We know that the slaves were brought into City Dock, right? We know that. But what else happened in Annapolis outside of slavery? We're going to be talking about that tonight. We have key points that we're going to be covering. This series in particular will be covering economics, education, elections, and entertainment. So we assembled these 4 panelists, these experts, and that's what we're going to go over. For the next minute or so, I'm going to be reading the proclamation. Whereas the City of Annapolis strives to, let me see, excuse me a second, let me put on my glasses. I'm getting old, Carl. It's the first time I've ever admitted that. Okay. Whereas the City of Annapolis strives to advance policies and practices that create opportunities for all people to thrive. And whereas the contributions to innovation in science, technology, business, and the arts by Black Americans and African Americans have been essential to the progress of our city, the state of Maryland, and our nation. And whereas the City of Annapolis acknowledges and rejects the long history of institutional and structural racism towards African Americans in the United States, which has resulted in socio-economic and other inequities that persist to this day. And whereas Black History Month is celebrated every February in recognition of the achievements by Black Americans and all people of African descent in the United States. And whereas historian and author Dr. Carter G. Woodson created Negro History Week in 1926 to encourage the study of Black life and history, particularly in the nation's public schools, and the tradition was expanded in 1976 to Black History Month. And whereas generations of African Americans have served our nation, the state of Maryland, and the city of Annapolis in positions of distinction, protecting the security of our nation and positively advancing social justice, civil rights, and public policy. And whereas rich traditions in African American cultural heritage have been passed from one generation to the next. And whereas all residents in the city of Annapolis are encouraged to recognize these accomplishments and celebrate their contributions of African Americans to our history and our community. Now, therefore, I, Gavin Buckley, Mayor of the City of Annapolis, Maryland, do hereby proclaim February 2022 as Black History Month in the City of Annapolis. Round of applause. Amazing. So we have a little entertainment here this evening. And I want you guys to put your hands together as we welcome Mr. David Stansberry. He's going to be singing Lift Every Voice.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Good evening, everybody. I also like to recognize my dad, Alvin Stansberry, who's accompanying me tonight. Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicings rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of a new day begun. Let us march on till victory is won. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, Thou who hast brought us thus far on the way, Thou who hast by thy might led us into the light, keep us forever in the path we pray. Lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met thee. Lest our hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee. Shadowed beneath thy hand, may we forever stand true to our God, true to our native land, true to our God, true to our native land.
Amazing. Thank you. One more round of applause for David Stansberry. Now I'm going to be introducing the panelists. We have first the Honorable Miss Janice Hayes Williams, our local historian. In education, we have the Honorable Alderwoman Rhonda Pendell Charles, our Annapolis Councilwoman. Elections, we have the Honorable Carl Snowden, former Annapolis City Councilman. For entertainment, we have the Honorable Vincent Leggett, Cars Beach, Blacks on the Chesapeake historian. Welcome, and thank you guys for being here. So I need y'all to keep clapping and bring this lovely lady to the podium to present her presentation, Miss Janice Hayes.
Can you hear me? Hello. And thank you, City of Annapolis, for inviting me. Go do your work, Tola. So they have asked me to talk a little bit about the past African Americans to Annapolis. And I want to start out with there's some rumors need to dispel. First and foremost, Annapolis never sold slaves at the market. Everywhere I go, did you all sell slaves in the market? No, that was for economics only, okay? You come and told her, because I'm getting ready to get upset. I'm gonna act up, okay? I'm already moved from the stage to a new place. So anyway, Annapolis is very quiet. This is not a slave-owning town. You need some help, sweetheart? So very few slaves, okay? Annapolis is very quiet, the place where you come for religious freedom, okay? It's not until Annapolis becomes the center of government, up from St. Mary's County to Annapolis because of the State House. Now we start to see the influx of African Americans. We come with our slave owners. So right now, the time of the legislature, that we call it, right now we have session. Annapolis is inundated with slaves, indentured servants, coming with senators and delegates. They're coming from all over the state. Charles Carroll, Howard County, he has a house in Annapolis, and he brings his best 12 to 15 slaves and indentured servants. Believe it or not, the Irishmen are responsible for the hard labor. Black women are mostly responsible for the food, taking care of the brandy and the finer things. The indentured women are the laundry women. So Annapolis is only very, I should say, filled with activity, just like right now. That's when all the bars and restaurants come alive when the politicians come to Annapolis. So next slide, Tola, you gotta watch me, okay? Few slaves, the ships come in, like Kunta Kinte, they come from Virginia and Delaware to buy slaves. not many here. They go out. They come during the legislature. So this gentleman, you know this is my guy. I found him in a museum. He was dug up during urban renewal, okay? And I brought him back home because he founded my church, Asbury. He is, in fact, this is the legacy that we come from. Daniel of St. Thomas Jennifer. All of you have seen the slave ad for Kunta Kinte. You always see John Rideout. Nobody noticed his name. He is the first president of the Senate. He comes to Annapolis from Charles County because his uncle is Thomas Stone, the signer. So when we come here, we are not, I'm going to say it like Frederick Douglass says it, we are not freed Negroes. No slave quarters in Annapolis. We don't have any fields. We don't have any cotton. So the people who come here are skilled, all of them. So he comes to Annapolis with his owner. Remember now, they don't really want you to live in the house, but they're not building slave quarters for you. So you have to build your own. So he's enslaved a blacksmith so good at what he does. His owner, the president of the Senate, I just love to say that. Every time I see Sir Alfred, I let him know. Anyway, he hires him out. Every time he works, he gets money. Every time he goes to another location, he gets the most, and he gives money back. Next slide, please. Get off the phone, Tola. Yeah, I'm going to wreck you all night. This is who we are in the 18th century. We are in the midst of resistance on our way to freedom. So this guy, his owner is dead. And he says, I want him to be enslaved 7 more years. His nephew, taking care of the estate, he said, no, I'm going to free you. He goes to the courthouse. He gets his papers for his freedom, and at the same time, he leases land for his family and friends. We know it as Acton Lane, City Gate Lane. He got rented the land. This is 1799, and he had a whole posse. Tola knows about it. Vince knows about it. Free black men creating the first black community, okay? So he says, okay, I'm making my money as a blacksmith, but I'm also a gardener. So this man says, guess what? I have apple and peach orchards. I need somebody to tend to them. It's him. All the way down to Spa Road. He sold the apples and peaches because his son attempted to be ordained as a minister, but they said he sold brandy. I don't know where that came from. Maybe the apple and peaches made bad brandy. He was early free black men creating the first black community in Annapolis. For Rhonda, he's the city's first taxi cab. He had a coach. You can read in the diaries of our slave owners about him. He takes them to Baltimore, to Washington. He has money, and he can see, he and his friends see those enslaved that don't need to be enslaved. Economics. What does he do with his money? He buys other people out of freedom. He's a pioneer because he says, look, we're free. We need somebody, somewhere to live. And his brother-in-law, Acadian, we don't talk about them much because they are mixed. They're black, Indian, they're different. They just come here for Catholicism and they are enslaved. But his brother-in-law becomes the master carpenter of Annapolis. So everything that Carl saw growing up on Acton Lane, those are the houses that were built in the early 1800s. Next slide. Next century, their resistance continues through using their money. They buy land. They start the church they're standing in front of in 1803. That's unheard of. They're following Mother Bethel in Philadelphia. But these men, I gotta do this. I'm sorry. Somebody here is related to somebody, but this code goes to Carl Snowden. This man here, his name is William Butler. He's the first elected official in the state of Maryland. And his house is next door to City Hall, where you go to work. All of these men, when you talk about entrepreneurship, that was not a word, it was a way of life. You don't get free and you don't get free and go back and work for the owner. You're already skilled. Next. This 18th century brings about a kind of freedom in this town that we don't see now. Annapolis was completely integrated every street in the city. For example, Market Street. The market started at the bottom of Market Street, but most of the residents are black. We had all kinds of professions. Mr. Hebron, the fish market. By the late 1800s, he's the president of the Union Oyster Packing Company. If you're from Eastport, you hear the name Herbie Sadler. Well, he worked for this guy when Herbie Sadler was 12 years old. That's how he got in the business, because of Mr. Hebron. He catered to the finest restaurants in Baltimore, 24 employees, but for us, we were always a double income family. I remember when I was having kids and they were talking about double income, no children. Everybody that was free and black, everybody worked. So they're free, he's a merchant, and what does she do? She has a luncheonette in the Old Fourth Ward. So she continues to make money. Late 1800s to the 1900s was a good time. I want to go back and mention, why do I use the term resistance? Here I am, a free black. I'm buying land. I'm building churches. And the city of Annapolis says, no, 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 but you can't vote. 1899, this first black community about to build a church, the city in 1805 said no black man could vote. They continued to work. I call it resistance. Told her, you watching me? The legacy was land. The legacy for Black Annapolis was land. You might not know it now. The brother-in-law of Smith Price is the master carpenter. He's building everything. This place you know as the Lucky Knot. Before that it was Reed's Drugstore. One way in, another way out. Built by an African American. It was my father that told me about the Matthew Shorter House. And lo and behold, it's in the annuals. When there's a fire, you could be sure that the black property was pulled down. And of course, Mr. Matthews sued the city. Next. Market Street. You ever stroll down Market Street with the different color houses? Again, black men out of slavery. The town was wide open. Every corner, a corner store. But the legacy was land. So Mr. Butler, our first elected official, built all these houses on Market Street as a legacy for his children. Many free blacks didn't stay in Annapolis because of racism. If you could pass as white, you went north or west. You didn't stay here. So Mr. Butler built all these houses in 121 and 123 was the home of the First Baptist Church. They rented from Mr. Butler. They were there until they just made too much noise. They wound up moving to the Old Fourth Ward. '18th, 19th century, Annapolis is so different. So many businesses, seamstresses, caterers. Have y'all heard about Aunt Lucy? There's a house 2 doors down from the Bryce house. She was the favorite cateress to all of the governors. It took me a long time, but I found out who her family is. Still cooking, still making crab cakes. When you go to the boat show, take home a Maryland memory, it's her family. Is my time up? Almost. Carl's looking at me because he wanted me to go. 20th century. Annapolis is on fire. Wally Bates, 1899, opened the first black kindergarten. It's all about, from slavery to our freedom, is about the community. It's about organizations that take care of people. J. Albert Adams, believe it or not, grew up on Market Street. If you go down Market Street, if you go down Market Street now, no remnants of Black Annapolis. J. Albert Adams is the great nephew to Happy Adams, Vince. They grew up on Market Street. By the 1900s, we have money. We're sending our kids to school. First time they're going to college. He becomes an embalmer because his family can send him to school. And what does he do for the community? As an undertaker, he is the transportation from a patient at Crownsville Hospital that has passed away. And the family in the 20s and the 30s, how do I get that body back to the Eastern Shore? It was him. Benevolence and community is how they handled their money. He bought land. We now know it as the J. Albert Academy. He bought that land for entertainment. In the 20th century, you played tennis. You heard music because of J. Albert Adams. The 20th century brought so much consternation. Property, old ways, and now we're sending our kids to college. And guess what? We don't want to take Granddaddy's fish market. We don't want Uncle Joe's corner store. We're educated and we don't come back. And Annapolis is so different. By 1975, we have decided that these old properties of Black people are slums. Slum clearance begins and everything changes. And I'm going to stop here in 1975. 33 African American businesses disappeared because of urban renewal. So our legacy, I'm going to say we had a golden, gilded age as we came out of slavery. But nobody wanted us to vote so we could determine how we live. The city did that in 1805, and guess what? They came back in 1905 and did it again, and Wally Bates said, not this time. So I'm going to end here. I've bored you enough, but I hope I have dispelled some rumors about Annapolis. We did not sell slaves at the market, and freedom came all kinds of ways. From the owner, you bought it, and in Annapolis, believe it or not, the great majority of free blacks were children of indentured white women and slaves. The law said a white woman can have a baby by a slave, but her baby will be free. So I'm gonna leave you with that. Thank you so much.
One more round of applause for Ms. Janice Hayes. Thank you, Janice, for that very thorough information from our past and for clearing up these rumors. I think that was important. We did not sell slaves down at the market house. So thank you for that. I need you guys to welcome and put your hands together for our next panelist, our educator, and the Honorable Alderwoman Rhonda Pendell Charles.
Annapolis past education, the best of times, the worst of times. Good evening. We were the Annapolis High School class of 1972. We were born in 1954, the same year as the Brown v. Board of Education U.S. Supreme Court decision that declared the end of separate but equal. Now fast forward to 1966, 12 years later. So in 1966, we were completing our very comfortable segregated elementary schools, grades 1 through 6 in Annapolis. For me, at Parole University, the name that our principal, Walter S. Mills, gave our school. So in 1966, we were off to one of our two now newly desegregated junior high schools. New places, new people, new faces, exciting times. But 1966 was the year of forced desegregation in Annapolis and Anne Arundel County's public schools, 12 years after Brown was decided in 1954. By now, Anne Arundel County was forced to desegregate schools, arguably kicking and screaming for 12 long years. More specifically, the issue of equal pay for colored and white teachers had been settled by Maryland's Federal District Court in 1939 in Mills v. Board of Education of Anne Arundel County, 15 years prior to Brown. Yes, our principal, Walter S. Mills, was the plaintiff. In the Mills case, our former superintendent of schools for 30 years, George Fox, stated on the record, quote, "My worst white teacher is better than any colored teacher," unquote. The Mills case, decided in 1939, was one of the lower court cases that was grouped together as a body of cases that led to the successful and monumental and transformational decision in the U.S. Supreme Court case of Brown v. Board of Education, again decided in 1954, which declared that separate but equal should no longer be the law of the land. Yes, Walter S. Mills and all of the colored educators in Anne Arundel County prevailed in 1939. For example, the court found these facts. The difference between $1,058, which was Mr. Mills's yearly salary, and the minimum yearly salary received that would have to be paid to any white principal of a comparable school was $1,550. Or in other words, if Mr. Mills were a white principal, he would receive, according to the county scale, not less than $1,550 per year, as compared with his annual salary of $1,058. This is a salary differential of almost $500 per year. Therefore, as a result of this court decision, a further conversation regarding the accumulation of wealth would certainly be worth pursuing now. And who was this extremely capable and, yes, good-looking attorney who represented Mr. Mills, but also was the lead attorney in the Brown case. If you drive to and around Church Circle in Annapolis, looking across from the courthouse, you can prominently see him portrayed in a mural, none other than later appointed U.S. Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, the first African-American appointed to this court in 1967, who grew up on the west side of Baltimore City. So for many of us as students in 1966, the year of forced desegregation, the confluence of all of these events over several prior decades resulted in a cascading and overwhelming number of very traumatic and ugly experiences for which we were totally unprepared. Many of us made it through. Many of us barely made it through. Many of us did not make it through at all. We were expected to be pioneers. At the age of 11, we were not. Yes, some even dropped out of junior high schools, and the school system never even cared, much less bothered to check. And so it was indeed, in 1966, the start of the worst of times. Nevertheless, in 1969, we were off to Annapolis High School for 10th, 11th, and 12th grades. It was an opportunity to finally meet everyone in Annapolis from all of our neighborhoods: Parole, in town, Eastport, downtown, Spar Road, Bestgate, Carrs Beach, or run along the bay. Yes, these were going to be the best of times. However, within the first month of school, we were greeted with a food/race riot in the cafeteria and a whole host of racial tensions and issues that were very confusing and even frightening. Yet again, it was the worst of times. It was the history teacher who insisted that you never turned in your term paper, a paper that was worth 50% of your grade for that marking period, failure. And it was the science teacher who refused to give you a grade until the end of the school year when she filled in all of the 4 marking periods with ease, failure. And it was raising your hand in English class because you knew the answer constantly, but never getting called on, frustration. And it was a cheerleading squad full of faces that did not look like the rest of the school student body or anyone from Parole or in town or Eastport or downtown or Spar Road or Bestgate or Carrs Beach or run along the bay, frustration. And it was the students that you saw during the first month or 2 of school that you never saw walk those hallways ever again, failure. Suspensions, expulsions, and terminations were frequent, and they were meted out rapidly and without cause. Students were angry, parents were impotent, communities were unraveling, and on and on and on. So what little confidence you had up to this point by now had been totally depleted and faded, now just a distant memory. And it was the guidance council for subsequent decades, yes, for decades, as acknowledged by many former students and parents, the guidance council who practically laughed in your face if you even mentioned anything about going to college. I was one of those students. She told me that I was not college material. So many students did not even aspire to attend college. After all, what better person to assess your capabilities than your guidance counselor? And of course, she knew more than your parents, since many of your parents hadn't attended college themselves. And after all that I had seen, and after all that had happened to all of us, yes, I was truly fed up with school. So did starting a family and or marriage seem like a much better option at this point? So we started to see how these 3 years at Annapolis High were going to be. You started to know your place, do as you were told, and keep your mouth shut. For me, that was sometimes hard to do. Yes, at times I could be a handful. I kept my mother busy, going back and forth to school, sometimes when I couldn't quite keep my mouth shut, and for various and other sundry reasons. And my mother's unyielding and dogged, in-your-face persistence at Annapolis High culminated in my senior year with making the school correct many of my grades that were supposed to be changed, but never were. As a result, out of a graduating class of 666 students, I moved up in the rankings from number 123 to 92. Indeed, my mother was patient but firm. My father's response to my mother, and he was often frustrated with everything that was going on anyhow, responded to my mother, "Stop going down there, Rhonda needs to learn." And frustration abounded in my home on another front. More of this household frustration and even anger was based upon the directive that my mother had received from Anne Arundel County Public Schools in 1966 as a result of desegregation. After teaching algebra and mathematics at her very comfortable, segregated Wally H. Bates High School in Annapolis, and she and my dad having been students there themselves and met there, she was ordered to report to Southern High School, a school that really didn't know or understand what a Black student or even a Black teacher looked like, much less as a teacher having to deal with parents who never had a Black teacher teach their child or tell their child what to do. As a teacher and as a result, my mother learned firsthand the fine art of documenting everything. I use the word comfortable here for a reason, and here is one of the yearbooks named The Beacon from the Wally H. Bates High School class of 1964. And their mascot was the Little Giants, this yearbook being a very tangible symbol of this comfort that I'm describing. The Beacon and the Little Giants, two names that speak for themselves. And so an overwhelming number of these Bates High students succeeded under the extraordinary tutelage of these amazing educators and staff, many of them traveling from Washington, D.C. and Baltimore on a daily basis. So for many students, educators, staff, parents, families, and neighbors, the thought of leaving their own Black schools conjured up frightening experiences. In other words, a justified fear of the unknown. Moreover, children who came home with stories similar to what I and my schoolmates experienced simply heightened their level of apprehension and fright. And so yet again, it was the apprehension of the worst of times. However, some of the situations at Annapolis High did improve, thanks to the student leadership of the class of 1970. And overall, the students themselves got along well. Together, we cheered on our Fighting Panthers football team. Even one year, we traveled to Harrisburg and brought 5 busloads of students to the game. We screamed for our Running Panthers basketball team. One here, Brother Charles James. Getting a seat at the varsity basketball home games meant that you needed to get your seat on the bleachers at least an hour before the junior varsity games even started. And the cheerleaders, well, miraculously, they suddenly found some that had some rhythm. And after the games, we all parted around to Mr. Tommy Thomas's house. He was the man who led our community band who lived on Lafayette Avenue. And the weekly parties were right there in the mortuary. No corpses, but with the lights and music down low. And with a piano in full view that you had to dance around. And during the week, the fun and hijinks in the cafeteria were legendary. Nevertheless, you still knew your place, did as you were told, and kept your mouth shut. However, it was the actions of one student on one particular day who decided that enough was enough. This student decided to speak truth to power. Then taking a page out of President Roosevelt's book, it was a date which will live in infamy. That student was Tommy James, the brother of Charles James, right here tonight. Tommy grew up in College Creek Terrace in the Clay Street community, and I was an eyewitness to what happened on that infamous school day. I will shorten this story considerably here due to lack of time. After about a month into class, the teacher had gradually started teaching the white students who were sitting on one side of the room. Tommy suddenly confronted the teacher. Why are you only teaching them and not us? At that point, I looked up from my doodling, yes, I was doodling, and suddenly realized that Tommy had forgotten his place. Tommy's voice was like a bolt and a streak of lightning coming through that second floor window in Maryland Hall overlooking Severn Hall. I would suspect that at first the teacher pretended or chose not to listen, like he really didn't hear Tommy. So then Tommy stood up, started pointing his finger in the teacher's direction, and repeated his question with more force than before. Why are you only teaching them and not us? And now I knew it was on. When that teacher turned around and looked at Tommy, he looked at him straight in the eye with the most evilest of looks. But Tommy was undeterred. He stuck to his question, looked at that teacher straight in the eye, waiting for an answer. This had turned into a showdown. For me, it really wasn't that serious, but for Tommy, it was really that serious. For Tommy, it was all about learning, and we weren't learning anything. Tommy was speaking truth to power. I watched that teacher march to the front of the classroom, still staring and glaring at Tommy, and Tommy still staring straight back at that teacher. And what I heard that teacher say to Tommy and to all of us on that day will be forever etched in my memory. The teacher then loudly proclaimed to everyone, "Do you want to know why I'm teaching them and not you all? It's because I'm prejudiced and I hate Black people." And then the teacher, rearing back, roared with laughter like it was some kind of a joke, really loud. I think at that point I must have blacked out, because for me, the room went completely dark and I went completely numb. I really don't remember much else except for the fact that I started to hear Tommy tell that teacher just what he thought about what he had just said to us, to all of us. No curse words or cuss words were used by Tommy. When I finally came to, the bell rang and class was over. And I figured so were Tommy's days at Annapolis High. We left class and walked to the cafeteria together. We knew there would be some sort of sham investigation. Tommy would be gone, and the school would find something to pin on the rest of us Black students in the class. Over the years, we had seen our friends kicked out of Annapolis High forever for much less than this. Yes, it was over, and we were all done. By the end of the day, what had happened had spread through at least parts of the school. When I got home, I immediately told my mother and father what had happened. They were appalled. As a teacher, my mother knew some of the teachers and administrators at Annapolis High. She made some calls. I think that by that time, what had happened had spread. The next day, we all wondered what would become of this very unfortunate and traumatic situation. It was soon readily obvious that someone in a very high position of authority had taken this teacher to task over what he had said to us, because from that day forward, the teacher taught and engaged with every student in that classroom. But how did that teacher really feel about what he was obviously forced to do on such short notice? How did he really feel about us? What would have happened if Tommy hadn't confronted that teacher? I had no idea. But under such circumstances, I would suspect that the teacher probably wasn't very happy about it. Who would be? Yes, it was Tommy who had made the difference. Tommy wasn't afraid of anyone. Later, I had to admit it. At the age of 17, Tommy had the maturity and the guts to speak up and to stand up and to confront that teacher, because we weren't learning anything. And Tommy took it all on himself when the rest of us just haplessly sat by and let it all happen, guilty as charged. And we thank Tommy for doing what he did for all of us. And what happened to that teacher? He continued to teach at Annapolis High for many more years. Unfortunately, Thomas Lavelle James passed away on February the 11th, 2018, as a result of complications from the flu and then pneumonia. I drove a group of schoolmates to his wake and funeral in Harrisburg. Tommy had completed his undergraduate studies at York College in York, Pennsylvania, majoring in sociology, where he played basketball on scholarship, moved to Harrisburg and completed his master's degree in criminal justice from the University of Baltimore. He rose to become the second highest ranking official within the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania's Department of Corrections. However, he had a huge heart. Among many other community outreach successes, he worked tirelessly with special sexual criminal offenders. When former Pennsylvania Governor Tom Ridge was named by President George W. Bush to serve as the first Secretary of Homeland Security in 2001, Secretary Ridge invited Tommy to join him in Washington, D.C. as one of his undersecretaries. However, Tommy respectfully declined, choosing to remain in Pennsylvania with his family. However, his mother, sister, and two brothers remained in Annapolis. And in 2019, we made sure that Thomas Lavelle James's name was placed on Annapolis High School's Wall of Fame. Now let's fast forward to the 21st century, specifically 1996 to 2002, when my children attended Annapolis High School. My husband, Marvin Sr., who's from Texas, and I immediately joined the Sports Boosters Club because our son Marvin Jr. and daughter Rochelle excelled in 5 sports combined. Right from the start, Marvin and I decided that we would work the concession stand at the games. All was well until the 2001-2002 season when the club took over the concession stands. It was extremely obvious that some of the club members did not mind us working the concession stands, that is, preparing and/or cooking the food, but they absolutely did not want us to work as cashiers handling the money. In other words, can we folks be trusted with the money? Are we all thieves? Mind you, Marvin had been a senior accountant with Anne Arundel County Public Schools since 1985, always based at the central office. And ironically, part of his job was to be responsible for the accounting of all of the funds that are taken in from all of the sports programs throughout the county schools. In other words, the athletic gate receipts. So he worked very closely with the central office's athletic department. But me being me, I bogarted, yes, physically forced, my way into the cashier's position most of the time. Not that I minded preparing or cooking the food, which I did on some occasions, though it was my choice, but I was determined that if they didn't want me back there handling the money, then they would have to physically and forcibly remove me from that cashier's spot. Yes, I became unmovable and provocative. It was so obvious, me being a cashier, until many of the Black parents and attendees at the games took me to the side and asked me in a whisper, "How did you get them to let you take the money?" It was even that obvious to them. I told them that they knew that I wasn't backing out and that I wasn't backing down. Soon I got more and more Black parents working as cashiers at the concession stands. Yes, these parents became empowered and confident. In August 2006, I was asked by the principal to tell my abbreviated stories for 1 hour to the entire Annapolis High School staff. When I was done, there wasn't a dry eye in that full auditorium, and I received a standing ovation. Even now, I have people coming up to me telling me that it made a big difference in how they saw and responded to our students at the school after they had heard my stories, and that these stories need to be repeated over and over again. Enough of these unfortunate stories over decades and multiple generations have resulted in too many instances of Annapolis people just giving up, becoming hopeless and helpless and powerless, oftentimes leading to serious health and emotional problems, trauma, etc., and them then passing these negative traits and feelings onto their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, and onto our communities and beyond. Only lately have I come to realize and accept the fact that what happened to me and what we collectively experienced, along with many of my schoolmates for many decades, resulted in clinically traumatic experiences that have continued to affect us deeply ever since in every aspect of our lives. Yes, we see the world differently. Therefore, without a doubt, Superintendent Fox's testimony regarding colored teachers and educators in Anne Arundel County Public Schools in the Mills case in 1939 sowed the seeds of superiority, inferiority, and distrust that were allowed to permeate and fester throughout the school system for decades. There being a direct impact and correlation and link between Mr. Fox's testimony as the leader of our schools and the actions of those under his leadership. And when the schools were forced to desegregate in 1966, many still dug in their heels in opposition and defiance, and therefore refused to treat all students fairly, equitably, and with dignity and respect. And in the process, many of these educators were not held accountable at all for decades. For example, the teachers that I mentioned earlier. Moreover, for example, this sense of overall superiority continued to wreak havoc for generations and across a century. In a nutshell, Superintendent Fox's beliefs and actions continue to metastasize, as well as become totally ingrained and entrenched into the fabric and being of Anne Arundel County Public Schools way beyond 1939. Students who could have gone to college didn't. Parents who could have visibly contributed to their child's overall school successes were denied access on a variety of levels. Yes, generations have been wrongly affected. And yes, even today's generations. And yes, this still angers me, and this saddens me too. And yes, this drives what I do each and every day. Moreover, the dearth of public and subsidized housing communities in Annapolis, which began in earnest in the late 1960s, now 15 of them with a city population of 40,000, is a direct result of the overwhelming lack of education and equity provided during these dark periods, which is inevitably followed by the overwhelming and continuing historical sense of hopelessness, helplessness, and powerlessness, and yes, even anger and trauma, just where we find ourselves today. Combine that with the drastic changes since the 1970s in the nature of the jobs that were prevalent and flourishing for at least 75% of African American households here in Annapolis, namely at the Naval Academy, Crownsville State Hospital, Fort Meade, the old plastic plant in Odenton, the county school system itself, and the Old Fourth Ward's thriving Black businesses district along the Clay Street corridor. Businesses that were destroyed as a result of urban renewal, or as some have dubbed, urban removal. So when you take away, impact, and or limit the foundations, the underbelly and the undergirding of a community, the critical systems itself, namely education, housing, and employment, the triumvirate, what are you left with? 15 public and subsidized housing communities filled with African Americans in a city with a total population of 40,000. This is Annapolis's past, education, the best of times, the worst of times. Thank you, and God bless us all.
Thank you. I'm going to be bringing up this next man. Oh, before we go on, I would like to have the panel please come back to the stage. And then as I call you, you will come down and speak. Yes, please. Tola, if you could arrange the stage for the panelists, could please take their seats. While we're doing that, I need you guys to please put your hands together and welcome to the podium our next panelist, who's going to be talking about the elections, the Honorable Carl Snowden.
Let me first, Rhonda, that was a very moving testimony for what Annapolis was like. I want to take an opportunity to first thank the mayor of Annapolis for hosting this State of Black Annapolis. I don't think that we often pause enough to look at our history and where we've been. Oftentimes when I share things with people about history, it's just amazing how many people can live in a city and not know the history. Most Annapolitans don't know why Annapolis is called Annapolis. Most Annapolitans have no idea who Queen Anne was. Most people have never heard of the Duke of York. The Duke of York was a slave trader. He had a daughter named Queen Anne. That's who Annapolis is named after. The Duke of York is named after New York City is named after the Duke of York, and Annapolis is named after Queen Anne. Annapolis has a very interesting history. One of the things that I think is important for people to appreciate is people have to tell their own stories. History really is just a reflection of people recording their story and telling their history. And you gotta be very careful to listen with a ear that speaks. There was something that was said in the proclamation that was read by the mayor, and I'm positive that the majority of people heard it and they didn't hear it. The city in its proclamation declared that we will not be for institutional racism, systemic racism, what Rhonda was describing. The city wanted to go on record in 2022, making it clear That is not who they are. I often find that when you tell people things like what I'm going to be sharing with you on politics and elections, it's hard to believe. How could you go through a school system, matriculate to college, and then discover things like what I'm about to tell you? It is not true that the first Vice President of the United States of America, who was Black, which is Kamala Harris, brought the first blended family to the White House. As some of you know, the Vice President happens to be Black, her husband is white, and their stepchildren are white. It's called a blended family. And most people believe that's the first time that's occurred in American history. It is not. The non-Vice President of the United States was a man named Richard Mentor Johnson. Richard Mentor Johnson. He came from Kentucky and he married a Black woman at a time that the nation said that Black people could not marry white people. He did. He had 2 daughters by her. And despite the fact that there was this opposition politically, he would not renounce his daughters. Can you imagine that in the 1800s? The non-Vice President of the United States. By the way, he was Vice President under a man named Martin Van Buren. There's a street in Annapolis called Van Buren Street, which is named after this Vice President. Most people have no idea that the reason Martin Van Buren was not reelected was because he refused, his Vice President refused to give up his Black wife and daughters. How can we go through a school system and not know that? Some of you may know that he was not the first Vice President to have Black children. That honor goes to Thomas Jefferson, who had impregnated a 16-year-old Black child named Sally Hemings. It's important that we know history and we tell the history. There's a great big debate going on right now. What can you teach in the school system? What should be taught? There are general assemblies across the country that's passed legislation that prohibits certain things from being taught. There are many people living in Annapolis and Anne Arundel County. When I tell them what I'm about to tell you, they don't even remember it. So many people do not remember that Anne Arundel County banned Maya Angelou's book, I Know Why Caged Bird Sings, in 1998. Not 1958, 1998. And it happened on an African-American superintendent of schools, the first superintendent, whose name was Carol Parham. Politics. How does politics play into history? Here are a couple examples I want to give to you. Annapolis, as Janice referenced, was the first municipality, the first jurisdiction in Maryland to elect an African-American. Took place in 1873. What makes that year significant is it was 8 years after the Civil War. 1873, the first African-American got elected to the Annapolis City Council. African-Americans have been on the Annapolis City Council from 1873 to the present with only one exception. And that exception was in 1909, when the Maryland General Assembly passed what was called the Grandfather Clause. The Grandfather Clause was a law that simply said if your grandfather couldn't vote, you can't vote. African Americans were disenfranchised here in the city of Annapolis. There was no African American on the city council from 1909 until 1915. And the reason African Americans were able to vote again had to do with 2 Black plaintiffs who happened to be African Americans and the Republican Party. The Republican Party led the effort to restore the voting rights of African Americans. African Americans stayed on the city council, was returned to the city council in 1915. That case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And if you ask students who matriculate through Anne Arundel County Public Schools, are they aware that African Americans lost the right to vote? They don't know that. Knowing the history of this city and knowing the history of the system is very important. So from 1873 to the present, here's some things that have happened locally as it relates to elections in the city of Annapolis. African Americans serving on the Annapolis City Council were Republicans from 1873 all the way until 1981. The first African American Democrat to get elected in the city of Annapolis was from the ward that is represented by Alderwoman Pennell Charles. His name was Samuel Gilmer. He became the first African American Democrat. Prior to that, everybody that was elected who was black in the city of Annapolis were Republicans. That changed in 1981. African American Democrats have served up until this point. In fact, the last Republican to serve, the last black Republican to serve on the Annapolis City Council was a guy named George Kelly, who got elected as a Democrat and then switched parties and became a Republican, and he served. But everybody who's been on the city council since have been an African American. The population of Annapolis has shrunk. Annapolis once had a population of almost 40% African Americans. It is now down to 22 or 23%. There are more Latinos living in Annapolis now than African Americans. And that population is shrinking, not by accident, not by coincidence, not by happenstance. Politics affects everything we do. There's not a single thing that occurs where politics does not affect the quality of lives. The type of housing you build will dictate who moves into a city. Types of jobs you have, the kind of educational system you have, all important. I had an experience that I want to share with this group that I think is so important. Why it's so important that people, A, know their history, and then B, interpret their own experiences. When I was growing up in Annapolis, like most people, I read a book and read about a woman named Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was this magnificent woman that I read about, who in 1955 refused to give up her seat. I was told she refused to give up her seat because a white man asked her to stand up and give up her seat. And so for years, I thought that was the reason Rosa Parks was arrested. And then in 1984, I had an opportunity to meet Rosa Parks. She came to Annapolis for a Black History program. It was the program took place at First Baptist Church, which is on West Washington Street. And Rosa Parks coming in 1984 was just like celebrity. Everybody couldn't wait to see her and to hear her. And the church was packed as people walked in and watched this living legend. Rosa Parks walk in. And Rosa Parks was not a big woman. She was very diminutive in stature, very quiet-spoken. Amazing that this woman had this impact on the national movement. And she told her story. And at the end, a reporter, who happens to be white, said to her, "Mrs. Parks, why were you arrested in 1955? And what she said, I have never forgotten. She said, "I was arrested in 1955 because I refused to give up my dignity." It was never but a bus seat. It was never but people interpreting her experience for her. She understood her arrest was more than about sitting next to someone. It's about dignity. It was Martin Luther King Jr., who was only 26 years old, that said to Rosa Parks, but he was really saying it to the nation and the world, "Sister Rosa, it is better that we walk in dignity than ride in shame." And out of that came this incredible movement. The reason it's important for us to understand how politics and elections can impact. So I moved to take my seat. We're living in a time that is the most important time of our lifetime. In my opinion, there's no election that would be more consequential than the 2022 election. More important than 2024, please hear me. More important than 2024. It's what's going to happen in 2022. And we literally see it unfolding before us. The 2022 election literally will be about soul of America, what kind of nation we will be. Will we truly be a nation where we will prohibit people from learning true history? How can you create a law that says if you feel uncomfortable, you cannot teach it? How do you make people feel comfortable about Holocaust? Holocaust was an incredible experience. Millions of people were the victims of genocide. We want our children to feel uncomfortable. We want them to know that we can never have that kind of history repeat itself. Don't we want our children to know that here in the city of Annapolis, a man named Henry Davis in 1906 was lynched? Don't we want children to know the true history of our city? Do we really not want to talk about what slavery really was about? I'm an Annapolitan. I grew up in Annapolis. And Janice, I can just say this to you. While it is true that because of the size of Annapolis, Black and white lived in proximity to one another. But please make no mistake about it. It was two separate worlds. Two separate worlds. People will not know unless someone tells them this part of history. To be a mother, to be a woman, to never be called Mrs., to always be called girl, to never get the respect due to you because of your age. It creates an atmosphere in a city. 1898, there's this lynching. The only Black man elected at that time was a man named Wally H. Bates. He puts up a resolution that simply says, we want the city of Annapolis to go on record condemning lynching, which was illegal. Could not get a second vote. We got to know our history. What you see in front of you in Rhonda Pendle Charles is part of history. There have only been 7 Black women to ever serve on the Annapolis City Council. All of them are living. First African-American woman to get elected was a woman named Cynthia Carter. The year was 1997. Annapolis was founded in 1649. It was chartered in 1708. First Black woman did not get elected till 1997. Right now, as we speak, President Biden has announced that the first African-American woman will be appointed to the Supreme Court. And there's already opposition to that. Someone had the nerve to say, is she qualified? Call her an affirmative action appointee. Said it's a quota. I hope you can appreciate how insulting that is. Anne Arundel County, 366 years before an African-American woman could get appointed to the Anne Arundel County Circuit Court. 366 years. Didn't make any difference whether it was a Republican, a Democrat, a liberal, or a conservative. A Black woman living in Anne Arundel County could not get an appointment to the Anne Arundel County Circuit Court. Only one Black woman ever has been elected in Anne Arundel County and served on the Anne Arundel County Council. Only one. Her name was Sarah Carter. She's now deceased. The good news is that the mayor, in his proclamation, speaking on behalf of his colleagues on the city council, has said they declare that Annapolis is a city will not be involved in institutional and systemic racism. Sister Erica, can I get that thing? I just want to conclude with this remark, because I want people to hear something. And it's not for the people in the room, it's for people who are listening by way of television. Here's the line that I want people to be aware of. Whereas the city of Annapolis strives to advance policies and practices that create opportunities for all people to thrive, and whereas the contributions to innovation in science, technology, business, and arts by Black Americans and African Americans have been essential to the progress of our city, the state of Maryland, and our nation, and whereas the city of Annapolis acknowledges and rejects the long history of institutional and structural racism toward African Americans in the United States, which has resulted in social, economic, and inequities that persist to this day. And whereas Black History Month is celebrated every February in recognition of the achievement of Black Americans, all people of African Americans of African descent in the United States of America, they go on to claim that as a city, this is a political decision, that we will, as a city, fight to combat institutional racism. When Price Smith, who Janice referenced, came to this city, no mayor, no member of the General Assembly, including his owner, ever thought the day would come that a mayor would be elected in the city of Annapolis to make this incredible proclamation. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for your time.
Wow. Next up to the podium, we're going to be discussing entertainment. I'm going to ask that the two ladies of the panelists move your chairs to the right, and that Mr. Carl Snowden move your chair to the left. And we're going to put our hands together and bring up the Honorable Vincent Leggett. Blacks on the Chesapeake, they say.
Just like to say good evening to everyone. This has been a very powerful presentation and gathering. I should have known from the lineup it wasn't going to be tea and crumpets. Y'all really brought out the hardball players, the heavy hitters, and people that know what they're talking about. And my part of the story is going to talk about African-American beaches and recreation. And as the tagline said, entertainment is just not parties. But I wanted to use my time to focus on one of the premier beaches in the Mid-Atlantic region, Carrs and Sparrows Beaches. So if we could turn down the lights and turn up the music, and we're going to get this party going.
Book won big at last night's Oscar, scoring Best Picture. But before it was big, it was already shedding light on the adversities that African Americans faced during the restrictive era of segregation and Jim Crow. In Maryland, beaches like Ocean City and Sandy Point were for whites only. But a set of African American sisters turned beachfront land in Annapolis into more than just a listing in the Green Book, which was a real thing. They made it a safe retreat for Black Americans to thrive.
When I was growing up, Ocean City was segregated. I remember being in
the water, and there was a rope there with balls on it, and you knew that you couldn't go beyond the rope because on the other side of the rope was the white area.
And it was just something about whether it's the water fountains, the beach, the playgrounds, the libraries, the schools, there's something very humiliating about seeing the white-only sign or the colored-only sign.
I was probably 8 years old. I didn't know that I couldn't go to these other places.
There was a recent movie called The Green Book that kind of outlined a lot of these different facilities where it was safe for people of color to go. Well, Carrs and Sparrows Beach were one of those places. Here was the 1930s. You had 2 African-American females that owned acreage on the Chesapeake Bay.
It was a source of confidence and empowerment. It's history that many of our people haven't seen.
To see African Americans prevailing against all odds, being educated, business people, hiring people, adding to the tax rolls. They hired many of the local school teachers during this period of segregation where colored teachers were paid less than white teachers.
Carrs Beach was not a confined environment. It had the air of a festival. So people felt free.
The slogan was black feet and white sand. I mean, that was just so empowering, and no one could tell you to sit down or stand up. You could just come out and enjoy the Chesapeake Bay, enjoy the music, enjoy the food, enjoy the fellowship.
Some of the entertainers that came to Carrs Beach at that time were like Count Basie, Ella Fitzgerald, Chick Webb, Duke Ellington,
Ray Charles, James Brown, Sarah Vaughan.
Just to see people of color in charge, running something, was just very empowering to a downtrodden people.
I do feel a little sad that some of these beaches no longer exist, and I understand why, because when integration came, we decided to test all the things that we couldn't go to. They played such an important role, and as long as we don't forget that they existed, we've had some hard times, but we are survivors.
Even with all of those obstacles, as a community, African Americans found ways to prevail, how to strive, how to empower others, how to maximize opportunity. And so I think that message is just as relevant today as it was in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. Check 1, check 2, radio check. Tonight, tonight, tonight. That was the tagline from Hoppy Adams. I see a couple of hoppy folks out there dipping and dodging. And, you know, that film clip was talking about Jim Crow. And I've had this conversation with the Snowdens and others that he's changed his names to Mr. James Crow Esquire. He's not gone. Barriers still exist in our community. And as I listen to each one of the panelists over the last 30 years or 40 years that I've been in Annapolis, because I migrated from Baltimore. But as a young kid, my father worked in the steel mills up in Baltimore. And even in the unions in Baltimore, United Steel Workers of America, AFL-CIO, that they had outings for the workers. And in Baltimore, blacks, colored, Negroes, they've been called all these names over the centuries, couldn't go to the white facilities in the Baltimore metro area. And so they came down to Carrs and Sparrows beaches. And when my dad and his coworkers came back to Baltimore, the whites said, man, we want to come down there. Can we get in there? And they said, yes, they don't discriminate. It's no colored only or white only signs at those facilities. And then even when things loosened up a little bit and you had Sandy Point State Park, I'd had some conversations with people over the years, and they would say, well, Mr. Leggett, Sandy Point was really integrated. Well, you were over on the east side of Sandy Point, and you couldn't tell the beach from the sewer outfall. And so, yeah, everybody could come, but some had to turn right at Sandy Point, and some had to turn left at Sandy Point. So let's get the record straight. And even when Ms. Pendell Charles was talking, I mean, I worked for the Board of Education and was the president of the Anne Arundel County Board of Education, and people still shaking their head. I mean, when you just talk about how many women have served in this and how many women have served in that, I think it's a very short list of African-American men that have been president of this Anne Arundel County Board of Education that elected to integrate their schools 1 year at a time. I mean, the law came down from off the hill from the Supreme Court in '54, and this Anne Arundel County decided we'll do it 1 grade at a time, and hope enough for y'all fail, you wouldn't make it to the next year. So it was an attrition plan. And Janice and myself have toured around the DMV, and I was part of her posse for the reinternment of Price. And I mean, it was just such a spiritual experience to bring peace and rest. But this was just a very interesting, when I read about critical race theory, and as I heard the dialogue from these outstanding speakers, I said, is this critical race theory? To me, it sounded like African-American history is American history, and American history is African-American history, and they can't be told separate and apart. I do a lot of genealogical work, and my family hails from Rocky Mount, North Carolina. If you heard of these places, raise your hand, or down there where the 82nd Airborne is, down below Fayetteville. You go a little bit further down 95. If you ever drove down to Florida somewhere, you keep seeing the sign saying Pedro coming, Pedro coming. When you get to the last Pedro sign and turn a hard right, you go back to where my daddy and them was from, and they were sharecroppers. And my mother's family were near the Virginia line. And even coming through emancipation, when people were talking about the migratory patterns, even when you became emancipated, there were laws that you had to leave that state. And so I still meet legates all around the world looking for my people. And I say we're all cousins, because that was the system that we came up in. And even when we look here in Annapolis, the project that I've dedicated myself to is called Blacks of the Chesapeake, to try to show the contributions that African Americans have made to the maritime and seafood processing industry. And this is a port city. Again, working with Janice, with the United Nations Education Organization, UNESCO, just looking at port markers to memorialize the Middle Passage and ports of memory. And so again, we are working with the international community, and Annapolis will become a part of that as another place to tell the story, and tell the story in full color, but tell the story in a respectful manner, but truth is truth. You don't have to scream it out or holler it out, but just speak truth. And so it was great for me to hear Janice kick off, and then Rondell, and then Brother Snowden, and I just couldn't wait. It was like you see a good fight in the alley. Well, when can I get in? I mean, they just kept swinging and swinging and swinging. And so for me, my joy is interacting with the audience. I mean, I guess we have some time left, and so I'm gonna yield to the program managers. I just wanted to give you a sampling. I could talk about the subject, about the role of Black captains. And one thing, even about the one picture with the beach, I wanted to highlight. The roads from 1930 to 1970, when the beaches were flourishing, it wasn't R.S.T. Allen Boulevard or a road coming down. They were little snake roads, dirt roads. I mean, coming down Route 2 over the Old Severn River Bridge, and they had a couple of shows down there. James Brown might have been bringing in about 10,000. Chuck Berry brought in 70,000. And they said they couldn't get traffic cleared out of Annapolis till 4:30 that morning. But the watermen of the Chesapeake Bay, there wasn't any traffic jams out on that bay. These watermen, Black watermen, brought their boats from the eastern shore, southern Maryland, down the river, up the river. And they came to the beach, and not only were they the Uber drivers, but even once they brought a load in, they gave boat rides and other things like this. And so just showing a very enterprising group of people. So whoever's the program manager at this point, if there's some opportunity to circle back, dialogue, ask a question, if the program manager. So I'm out. Thank you.
You can keep that mic. And would the panelists please return to the stage? We're gonna do a quick question, a Q&A, quickly. You don't like it up there. You lost your, I think Brother Vincent got your mic. So while they do that, I want to give you yourselves a round of applause. And shout out to everyone who is listening and is tuned in. We're gonna just do a quick Q&A. I'm gonna be asking a couple questions here and then wrap up because we got closer to the end time. But this is amazing. State of Black Annapolis. One more round of applause, please. I'm going to start with you, Ms. Janice, for the economics. Blacks and other nationalities lived and worked together pre-Jim Crow. What was the impact on that community?
I'm gonna say it was called survival. When you look at the city of Annapolis, we're all different nationalities. When you go to the old Fourth Ward, that was all white. It was not until Civil War that Wiley Bates, Jeff, do you know Jeff Henderson? His uncle worked with Wiley Bates, and they actually purchased the property of Germans, Poles, and others. Between them, there were 90 real estate transactions, and it created the old Fourth Ward. So what I'm saying is, we're all Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. We came by water. We live together, and we are all mixed up. When I look at my DNA, yeah, that's the, when I started curse, it goes on. Thank you. So everybody from Annapolis has something. So what's this happening to me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes.
This isn't. Give it a second. They're working on it, Janice. Don't hold both of them. That's going to cause issues.
Hello?
There you go.
I'm a teacher's daughter. Don't do that again. So, the impact is that we all live together and work together.
Okay. What are some of the occupations did free Black slaves have? before the Civil War?
Like I mentioned, when we came,
I think your thumb is hitting the button.
so can you ask that question again?
What type of occupations did free blacks have before the Civil War?
Everything. Taking care of a community, you had to have all the skills. Carpenters, blacksmiths, tailors, cobblers. And what's so interesting about the free black community in Annapolis, 1890.
We can hear you.
Yeah, they can, that's my concern.
You have to remember, the free black population is mostly mixed. White mothers, black fathers, when they go before the court for mulatto bastardry, you had a baby by a black man. That child is free, and the court orders that this child is apprenticed. They have to be apprenticed to work until the age of 21. It started out 31. So I'm saying that to say, my microphone, stop it. These people, free blacks, are skilled artisans because they have been trained and apprenticed in every field.
Okay.
So I'm done with this thing.
Okay. Ms. Rhonda Pendell Charles, the great Justice Thurgood Marshall, worked on one of the earliest cases here in Annapolis, fighting for black teachers. What was the impact on Black Annapolis?
Well, I think the impact on Black Annapolis, first of all, was the equal pay for equal work, which ironically, it did not happen until a couple of years after that 39 decision. What happened was the school system said they couldn't afford it. So I think it was 2 years after 39. I don't think it took effect until 1941. But then, as I mentioned in my talk, you're talking about how do you accumulate wealth? When you have those many situations where blacks are not paid the same as whites, you cannot accumulate wealth. And we have that issue now that we talk about a lot, the black accumulation of wealth. And just those instances, and I see my friend and schoolmate Wendell Holland in the audience, his mom and dad were both educators. His father was a principal and his mother was a teacher. So in order for them to accumulate wealth, they're both in the same system in Anne Arundel County Public Schools, it's very difficult. And if you go on generation after generation, you're losing out. And the height of all this is the Tulsa, Oklahoma massacre. That's really the height of it. All these other, I won't say smaller instances, add up.
Thank you. The Annapolis has always been in Black representation, and this question is for Carl. Annapolis has always been in Black representation politically in this country. How significant is the history to the fabric of Annapolis culture?
I think it's very significant. One of the things that I think that African Americans being on the city council from 1873 to the present, they bring a perspective. I wish people, again, take the time, particularly with their children and grandchildren. I hear people make this comment. My mother lived to be 104 years old. And one of the things my mother would really get upset about is when someone would say nothing's changed in America, by extension, Annapolis. And she would get upset about that because she was born before women could vote. She was born at a time where segregation was real. Rhonda made this point, and again, I try to listen with it very, very closely to someone. She was saying that the trauma that people went through impacts on people generations later. And I think that's true. And I think that one of the reasons why I believe very strongly that we cannot allow politics to prevent true history from being told, because we pay a price for that. I want to end my remarks with something I think is very hopeful. I've come to believe that despite all the troubles, and there have been many, and all the challenges that are coming, my hopes rest with my grandchildren and young people. One day I was listening to my granddaughter, her name is Asada, and Asada was talking to a friend of hers and speaking Spanish. And when Asada finished speaking, I wasn't eavesdropping, I was just amazed to hear her speak Spanish. So I said to her, Asada, I didn't know you took Spanish in school. I thought you were taking French. And she said, Granddaddy, I don't take Spanish in school. So wait a minute, I just heard you speaking Spanish. Oh, she said, oh, no, Granddaddy. See, I have a Latino friend, and she's teaching me Spanish words, and I'm teaching her English. Because we're friends. We want to be able to communicate. To me, that's a great sign. To me, that's the future.
That's right.
When people have an opportunity to be able to want to speak another person's language, to share their values, and see diversity as something to celebrate. That's what I'm hoping the state of Black Annapolis will be, an opportunity to celebrate.
Yes, thank you. I agree. Mr. Vincent, how important was entertainment in the he gonna stand up on this one.
Yeah, well, I like to watch a lot of CNN, and regardless of what the question is, the guy's got one answer.
Okay.
So this is what I say is, as I talked about the Cars and Sparrows Beach, 1902, Mr. Fred Carr and Miss Wells bought 180 acres on the Chesapeake Bay.
Yes, sir.
But if you drive down Edgewood Road today, you'll see a wastewater treatment plant. And I'm an ex-college professor, and we call that environmental justice.
Yeah.
Because what the rules say is that if you're poor, limited income, and minority, it's a high probability the trash truck's gonna park in your neighborhood, the landfill's gonna be in your neighborhood, and the sewer treatment plant's gonna be in your neighborhood. So we have that. That's case one, attorney. Case two, we have a gated, multi-million-dollar, beautiful community. African Americans and whites live there. I have friends live there. Well, there is 5 acres left out of the 180 acres called Elktonia Beach. And I'm part of an initiative with Janice and others that are trying to raise about $7 or $8 million to buy that last 5 acres of land that's still there, called Elktonia Beach, to interpret the history and the legacy of Cars, Sparrows, Highland Beach, Arundel Bay, Columbia Beach, that just talk about African-American life on the Chesapeake Bay. So I don't know if that was your question, but that was the answer.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The question was how important, so thank you. Yes, absolutely. Does anyone in the audience have any questions for the panelists? Yes.
I'd like to know from someone on the panel, what really has been the impact of the recent change here in Annapolis in terms of the incoming Hispanic population? How has that impacted the social and political climate of Annapolis? And what has been the nature of development between that community, the Hispanic community, and the Annapolitans, especially African American Annapolitans, especially in areas like perhaps Parole, where there are large numbers of Hispanic people occupying that area now, that has historically been an African American community almost exclusively.
Any of you want to take that?
I guess that's my question. Just I guess a little bit of history. During the Civil War, African Americans worked in camp parole, and that's where the exchange of prisoners were between the Union and Confederate soldiers. We basically played an epilogue role in that war. African Americans not only were in part of the soldier part of the war, but they also were doing cooking and laundry and that sort of thing. They stayed once the war was over. Hence, you have a lot of African Americans in parole whose families have been there, had a presence there since the Civil War. My great-grandfather was a sergeant in the colored troops there. So anyway, so you had a large presence of African Americans in parole who've been there for at least a century or more. And this is kind of deep because it took me a while and I could be wrong, but this is kind of how I figured it all out. And this is Rhonda speaking. Like I said, you had the Naval Academy, which is privatized. Those jobs are pretty much gone. Crownsville State Hospital closed. Fort Meade privatized. Old Plastic Plant in Odenton closed. The school system, a lot of custodians, and the Old Fourth Ward. So what happened was a lot of the persons who lived in parole worked at the Naval Academy and Fort Meade, which means you were part of the federal government workforce. Unless you worked 40 quarters to collect Social Security, you do not get a Social Security check. We had a lot of people in parole who worked at the Naval Academy. Therefore, I surmise a lot of them only received one check. They got the federal retirement check, but not the Social Security check. If you have a spouse and dies, then that lowers your money as well. From what I can see, what had happened was a lot of the older folks, including my parents, have died off. The children eventually find out that parents had a reverse mortgage because they didn't take in enough money that month to be able to take care of the bills. The children were totally unaware. When the parents died, the children find out about this reverse mortgage. They may have had 2, 3, 4, 5 children who are unable to pay off that reverse mortgage. So they had to sell the homes, even though they wanted to stay there. Now, what was told to me, I can't say how true it is, that a lot of real estate agents kind of seized on the opportunity. We have a substantial Spanish-speaking community, and therefore a lot of Spanish-speaking residents have now been part of our parole community. I have personally, and others, have no problem with what we have in our community. But of course, you have a lot of African Americans who will say, I wish I hadn't sold, I wish this, I wish that, but were put in a position where they really had no other way out. Now, on the flip side, I will say there has been some consternation within the community. But I will give you one story that, and I'm gonna, Cousin Carl here, I'm gonna give a good news story. Back in May of last year, we had a horrific dirt bike accident on the corner of Parole Street and Forest Drive. A young Hispanic, I'll call him a child because he was 19 years old, died as a result of that. And I got this story from Ms. Downs, who's our acting Greater Parole Community Association president. And if I make an error, but the humanity of the story is what it is. The young man who was 19 who was killed had two younger siblings, one in middle school, one in elementary school. Apparently, the children who lived further up on Forest Drive were at home. The neighbor, who's an African-American woman, heard them screaming and crying. She has a bedridden father who's 92 years old. She left her dad in the bed, this African-American neighbor in her early 50s, no shoes on, didn't lock the door, ran outside to see about these children, these siblings. They apparently told them what was going on. She said, get in my car, call your parents, and I will shield you and stay with you until your parents come home. That is the spirit of the parole community.
Thank you.
What I will say is that story embolizes what is really is a transformation to where we're going. Oftentimes, once you know your neighbor, and I will tell this little small story. I had a neighbor, Spanish speaking. I had gone to him about an issue as an alderwoman. He really didn't want to hear me at all. Just tuned me out, walked away. Our neighbor passed away. I was asked to speak at the funeral. I spoke at the funeral, and I told a story about our neighbor, and it was a funny story. I try to be humorous when I speak at funerals because people need an uplift. And so when I got done, the Spanish-speaking neighbor was at the funeral. And he looked at me, and he came to me and thanked me. And ever since then, we're good friends.
Good.
So it's those incremental changes and incremental relationships that's we're going to be good. We're going to be fine.
Yes.
That's the bottom line. No matter who your neighbor is, it doesn't really matter. Thank you.
Yes. Answered your question very thoroughly.
Yes, I appreciate the answer as well as the illustration and amplification through your stories. Thank you. You're welcome.
So, Ms. Janice, you have something to say really quickly as we wrap up?
Yeah, I just want to add to that. Growing up here, what has happened when I grew up, all of the cooks were black, okay?
Mm-hmm.
There is such an economic change. When I go downtown, nobody black is cooking, okay? We don't live here anymore. The same thing what Rhonda is saying, not just a reverse mortgage. Opportunity is not here, okay? I'm married. I'm having children. I don't want to live on Fleet Street. Who's going to park their cars? My kids. As we get older, we look at Annapolis, some of us, we go away to college, we have professions, but if I just look downtown and I see the change, I was one of two African Americans working downtown in 1983. Where are we? So as the change, people come in for less money. That's the big difference, okay? And what we had to look forward to, as Carl stated, everything is changed. Now we have the census. Now we will see African Americans rents go this way because Hispanics will go this way, but the town is changed almost 100%. We don't have a black restaurant in Annapolis, okay? Economics.
Yeah.
Now, I'm a black woman, I want to start a restaurant in the old Fourth Ward. Place is open, and they said, okay, Jen, it takes $75,000 to get a grease trap so I can fry chicken. But the Oriental down the street is grandfathered in. So we have so many problems in terms of economics,
Yeah.
okay?
And work to do.
Work to do.
So, and on that note, that's why we are here tonight for the state of Black Annapolis, particularly the past. Next week will be the present. It'll be another 4 panelists of experts that sit here before you. And then the week after that will be the future. And hopefully on each series, you walk away with very thorough information about the past, the present, and the future. So I want to thank you, Ms. Janice. Thank you for all of your thorough knowledge. Your knowledge is unbelievable. If anybody that can hear my voice has not taken a tour of one of Ms. Janice's tours here in Annapolis, please do so. Everyone that is listening online and watching online, please take one of those tours and get yourself familiar with our city of Annapolis. Thank you, Ms. Janice. Thank you, Ms. Rhonda Pendell Charles, because just like when you said you boat-guarded your way to that cash register to be a cashier, you have that very same fire and strength and endurance to go through and serve on the council right now and get things done that we need. So I appreciate you, and I know our city appreciates you so much. Thank you, Carl Snowden, for just everything. I feel like every time you speak, it is school time, right? Class is always in session, and he reminds us of how important it is to be Black and not forget. That's one. And that thank you for giving us a lesson and knowing now that Rosa Parks did not give up her seat because she was white or Black or for another white person, but because of the dignity. So thank you for that lesson. I've learned that today. Vincent Leggett, like you, I am much like you with entertainment. My expertise is radio and MCing, so I love that interaction. Thank you for the knowledge of bringing that information about old radio, old entertainment that was here, right here on Cars Beach. Thank you for just continuing to just educate us on that music, because that was important, and we're gonna keep on.
And what I was
bringing it
saying
back.
is the baby is on life support, but the baby will live.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's right. The baby's on life support, but the baby will live. Thank you, guys. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you to the Anne Arundel County Public Library. Round of applause for them. And the Michael Bush staff. Thank you so much. Thank you
Thank
to
you,
our
Ms.
staff.
Erica Griswold,
Oh,
for being
thank
a
you.
wonderful moderator.
Yes. Thank you guys for coming in, and thanks to our Mayor Gavin Buckley. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you for your leadership, and thank you for just allowing us to create this space to acknowledge Black history, right? And that we never forget. So thank you to our Mayor Gavin Buckley and the proclamation that was made today. Right? Thank you for that. Thank you, everyone. See you next week. See you next week for our present series for the state of Black Annapolis. And last but certainly not least, please, if you have anything in your hands, I need you to put your hands together and thank Adatola Ajayi. He has put this thing together. He is the mastermind behind this thing. Thank you, Tola. Thank you.